What's up, hobby friends? My name is Casey and welcome to another miniature rescue. This week, we're going to take a look at some space wolves that need some serious help. I spend a good amount of time going through eBay listings looking for Warhammer minis. And there are an absolute ton of them out there, like a lot more than you might think. Over 500,000 in fact, and out of those, about 300,000 are actually used models. Even in that large number, it can be kind of hard to find really good listings, but every so often you do come across specific sellers that just seem to have it all, and they just keep the goods coming. I happened across a particularly good seller about a year ago, and I've gotten some great deals on older models as well as some of the absolute best ones for rescuing. Within this eBay store, there are probably only a handful of actual painters, 3 or 4 maybe. As far as I've been told from the seller, most of these lots came from a few larger collections that were purchased at the same time. So there are a ton of models, and they're all in about the same condition. These are all pretty perfect. Not only are these awesome older models, but most of them are in a unique position of being not very well painted, but with maximum effort at the same time. It's something you don't see very often, and I truly hope that the person who painted most of these miniatures is out there and still painting today. The first thing you notice with a lot of these models is that the paint is rather thick, and it's not exactly the cleanest paint job. My guess is that these are someone's first models, so it makes perfect sense. These are pretty close to some of my first minis, so I totally get it. Where it starts to take an interesting step forward is in the details. There are little things on most of these models that suggest that the original painter was really trying to improve their skills and trying to make their minis that much better. On each type of model, there are extra bits of freehand or small attempts at trying to make these models just a little bit better. Things that would be so much harder if you were already having trouble fitting your paint to a good consistency. When I first found these models on eBay, I bought quite a few of them, and since then I have painted most of them on the channel. These Space Wolves are the last ones I have on hand from the same seller, and more than likely the same original painter. And the really sad thing is that the eBay store that has been selling these is closing shop pretty soon, so they won't be around for much longer. The store owner did tell me that pretty much everything will be on sale until it's gone. And honestly, who knows how long that'll be, but I wanted to paint up the last of the models I have and get some eyes on the store just to kind of help out as much as I can. So this week we're going to be taking these absolutely epic Space Wolves and giving them a bit of an upgrade. I intend to keep as much of the original idea with this squad, maintaining most of the colors, going a bit harder on the freehand to make them look a little bit cleaner, upgrading the bases, and making the snow feel colder and wetter. And while trying to pay homage to the original painter and just making these models something more akin to what they may have been going for in the first place. The first thing will be to take these Space Wolves and put them in a bath of LA's Totally Awesome in my Sonic Jewelry Cleaner. This will dramatically speed up the process of taking the paint off, and we can get these guys cleaned in the next 20 minutes or so. After the bath, you can see how much the paint has already come up off of the plastic. Some light toothbrushing and we can get right down to bare plastic. An always satisfying process too. I seriously can't get enough of this. Once the paint has been cleaned off, I can go into each model with an X-Acto blade and start to scrape away any excess paint that may have deposited into deeper recesses, as well as scrape away any mold lines and extra plastic that wasn't removed from the pieces during assembly. This is a good time to point out that one of the best things that you can do to improve the look of your models, even when you're new to painting, is just to clean them up before primer goes down. Taking the extra few minutes to remove mold lines and plastic burrs from the sprue just helps your model look even better once that paint goes down. The bases on these models are all in pretty bad shape. The base material looks like sand mixed with paint or glue or maybe both, and it's really caked onto the base and models. I want to rebase these on something different, so I need to remove each model from their base. They get cut away and I start looking into what we're going to do for a replacement. Space Wolves are a pretty popular faction in Warhammer 40k. I think they're one of the only Space Marine factions that go out of their way to look distinct and different from the other Space Marines. The older models in particular all had extra bits and wildly different looking parts from your average Space Marine. So much so that I would say that these are the least Space Marines. I mean, they obviously are, but when I look at these, I don't immediately see Warhammer Space Marines so much as sweet Vikings in space armor. The point is, Space Wolves just hit differently than your average Marine. That also means that the variety of upgrades is quite abundant. There's practically no shortage of space Viking stuff you can find on the internet to either buy physically or print out with a nifty 3D printer. I happened across these sweet base toppers, something that I am quickly becoming a massive fan of, and decided that they would be perfect for this squad of 5 Space Wolves. Each base has a variety of temple ruins with Viking runes, a lot like the original painter was going for, and some skulls that are a close match to the ones on the actual models. It was hard to see, but there were actually skulls on most of the bases that the models came with, but they were mostly covered up with rocks and snow. So I wanted to let these ones breathe a bit and so you can actually see them. Base toppers are a great way to make your bases super nice without having to spend too much extra per model. If you have a 3D printer, then they're pretty quick to print up and don't take up too much resin. And if you want to buy them already printed, there are actually a ton of relatively inexpensive options on sites like Etsy. But you could always check your local hobby shop to see if they have a printer available to use, or even your local library. Yeah, really, check. I'll paint these up by dry brushing some gray onto each one and just picking out a few details. I want to put some snow on all these as well, so some of this will get covered up. But the idea will be to put in some warm-cold contrast using colors and materials. So I start by dry brushing a dark cool gray all over the bases. That pretty much covers everything on the base except the deepest cracks. Next will be a slightly lighter gray to start to catch the raised detail and fill in a good amount of what we just put down. Still leaving those cracks, but also flat surfaces at an angle now have the darkest gray. That acts as a shadow to the mid-tone gray. And finally, a coat of light gray on top to catch the edges and define the details. A pretty easy 3-color stone that's always a good go-to when you need to paint some rocks. For some extra details, I want to put some coppery gold into some of those fancy filigree in the stone, and weather that down with some teal paint. That way we have some color in the stone and it looks a little bit older. I also take a small amount of brown pigment powder and warm up little spots on the base. It contrasts nicely and just brings in more color variety. What I like about these particular toppers is that they come across like Viking runes, but a lot of them have pipes and metal running through them as well, and that helps with material variety and color variety, and it really helps sell the 40k aesthetic. Before putting models or snow on the bases, I want to finish them off with a couple of little plants, bringing in some yellow flowery tufts that add a little more color and tie nicely into the color that we're gonna have on the models. Remember, a lot of them had a good amount of yellow on them, and more of that warmer dark brown that plays off the pigment powder, and eventually warm shadows that we're gonna have in the yellows on the armor. All things that are gonna make sense when we put the pieces together, but something you do want to be aware of when you go to put a base together before you've painted a model. You want contrast and you want things that just draw your attention, just enough to make the model look like it fits into its surroundings as naturally as you can. At least that's the goal. We'll see how it goes. Alright, so we have some sweet bases. Now let's move on to the freshly primed models and get those painted up and put together. We dry brush the bases with 3 colors of cold gray. And I want to point out that while I'm using an airbrush to do something similar with 3 colors of cold blue gray on the armor, it also works pretty well to paint Space Marines with the same dry brush that we use for the bases. If you just keep the paint a little bit wet on your dry brush, you can get some seriously smooth results. After the base colors go down, I'm going to bring in some silly putty to mask off the shoulder pads and fill those in with the same yellows that the original owner had. Only instead of pure yellow, I'm going to shade the bottom of each shoulder with a warm brown, tying them into the base a little better and just giving them a more elevated look to each shoulder pad. If you want to do this without an airbrush, then using thin down scrag brown from Citadel from about halfway down the pauldron to the trim is what you need. Just keep it super thin and only pull your paintbrush, or alternatively, pop the shoulder pads off and dry brush those colors on. Once the airbrushing steps are taken care of, I can fill in the rest of the materials with some basic colors that were already on the model. Gold for the Aquillas and trim, silver for the guns, and brown for the fur. In this case, I took a little bit of liberty with the furs and went with a purple brown, just something I like the look of personally, and I finished them off with highlights of gray, not completely dissimilar from the original. Overall, it's mostly about keeping the paint thin and being patient. If you thin out your paint too much, then just let it dry and go over it again. If it ends up going on too thick, that's fine too. Just spread it out as much as you can so it doesn't clog up too many of the details. There isn't a formula for doing this perfectly, and even more so, there are use cases for thick and thin paints. You just need to paint more and more to see which works best for what situation. For the most part, these models are pretty fun to paint. The armor with a dry brush or airbrush is pretty easy to do quickly, which makes building an entire Space Marine army pretty easy to do most of the time. I think that's probably why they're popular. Space Wolves, though, each have unique details that make them stand out. Not so much the newer Primaris models, but these older kits are just really good and still hold up really well, even if they are kind of tiny by comparison. Taking your time to pick out small details and getting at least a base coat on will go a long way to making even a few models look good next to each other. Small imperfections don't stand out as much, and they look cohesive simply because everything got filled in and is at least consistent. After everything is filled in, it's a good idea to lay down a wash over the entire model. That will pull everything together even more and cover up some of the issues if you may have missed something or overspilled a little onto something else. I generally use oil washes because you have a lot more control over the outcome, but a bottle of dark tone or gnome oil can work incredibly well as long as you make sure it doesn't pool up in weird places on the model. After the wash goes down and eventually dries, it's time to put the models on their bases. I pick out the positions I like with each model and glue them down, making sure not to overload the model with glue so we don't overspill onto the painted bases. Very important. And finally, some thinned down PVA in a few select spots on the models and bases, and some snow flocking will go down to finish off these models. Space Wolves are some of the absolute best Space Marines out there, and it's kind of a shame that we don't see them like we used to. Yeah, I know, there are Primaris upgrade kits and stuff, but it's not quite the same as it was back in the day. The kits available now are a lot more like blank canvases for converting your own, which kind of feels like an excuse to say it's being more creative, but in reality, we're just getting fewer options overall. The older kits had great sculpted bits that came right in the box, and it felt a lot more like you were buying into a separate army altogether, which I kind of miss. Now, at least we still do get some character models from time to time, and it's not the end of the world. There are still a ton of older models out there that are in need of help, so I, for one, am looking forward to getting out there and going on the hunt for even more. It's also important to remember that we all start somewhere, and that there are a ton of little things that we learn as we begin painting and working our way through more and more models. So when I look at these models, I can see that there was a good amount of effort put in, and really cool ideas were explored. But skill level takes time to catch up to our imagination. Just keep practicing and painting, and you'll get there eventually. I'm not sure how much longer that eBay store will be around, but I will put the links in the description of the video if you want to head over and pick up similar models to rescue. Thank you again for joining me on another miniature rescue. If you like something about this video, please consider hitting that like button, sharing this video with your hobby friends, and of course, subscribing for more miniature rescues. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video. And we can't forget these fantastic old Space Wolves. Thanks again.